Fog clung to the Appalachian hills the way old secrets cling to the families that try to bury them. I'd heard the rumors for years, half-told stories whispered in gas stations and roadside diners, always ending the same way: don't go looking for them. Folks who do either come back quiet, or don't come back at all. But stories like that have a way of pulling you deeper, especially when everyone seems desperate to keep you away. It was the scent of damp earth and the uneasy hush of the pines that guided me down a narrow dirt road just outside Odd, West Virginia. The map didn't show it. Most locals claimed not to know it existed. But the road felt older than any of them, carved by footsteps that never walked anywhere else. By the time I reached the clearing, daylight had already begun to fade, swallowed whole by the thick canopy overhead. Then I saw it, the sagging house with its peeling paint, crooked windows, and a porch that moaned under the weight of invisible watchers. Something moved inside. Not fast. Not startled. Just aware of me. The first figure stepped into the doorway with a blank expression that seemed carved from the mountain itself. No greeting. No curiosity. Only a stare that made the air tighten around my ribs. I wasn't sure if I should speak or run. But before I could decide, another silhouette drifted behind them, then another, and another, each one carrying a strange quietness that felt heavier than sound. This was the place people warned me about. The home of the Whittakers. America's most isolated bloodline. A family shaped by silence, shadowed by generations, and hidden so deeply in these mountains that the rest of the world forgot they existed. I didn't know it yet, but crossing that threshold would blur the line between the living, the remembered, and the things that thrive in places where no one watches. And as the door creaked open on its own, as if inviting me inside, I finally understood why the town stayed quiet. Some stories aren't meant to be found. This one found me. The old journal was discovered on an afternoon that felt wrong from the start, the kind of day when the air hangs too still and even the insects seem to avoid making noise. The traveler had stopped near an abandoned pull-off along a forgotten backroad outside Odd, West Virginia, intending only to stretch his legs before pushing deeper into the hills. He noticed something half-buried beneath the wet leaves and moss, a rectangular shape softened by years of rain and rot. At first he thought it was just another piece of trash left by passing hunters, but when he lifted it, the weight was unmistakable. It was a journal, the leather cover softened like old skin, the pages warped and swollen from decades of dampness. A buckle still clung to the side, rusted through, as if someone once tried to keep whatever was inside from getting out. When he opened the first page, the smell of mildew and time leaked out, but underneath it was something stranger, something sharp and metallic. The ink had bled into the paper, turning sentences into smudged shadows, but the drawings remained disturbingly clear. Charcoal sketches of faces with wide, hollow eyes stared back at him. Some were marked with excess across the mouths. Others had their heads tilted at unnatural angles. A few pages later, there were crude maps, not of any recognizable town, just winding lines leading into the mountains, all converging at a spot marked only with the words "The Edge." Scrawled notes filled the margins, fragmented thoughts, strange warnings, and names repeated again and again, only one fully readable: Whittaker. The traveler flipped deeper into the journal and found pages where the handwriting grew frantic, the letters slanting wildly as if the writer was rushing to record thoughts faster than his mind could shape them. One passage spoke of voices outside the cabin at night, voices that didn't sound entirely human. Another page showed a small shack drawn in shaky strokes, circled 3 times, with the words "They don't come from town" anymore written beneath it. The final entries were nearly illegible, written in a trembling hand, each line shorter than the last. The last fully intact phrase he managed to decipher said, "No one should follow them. No one should see what they became." Wind moved through the trees, lifting the pages as if something unseen was eager to keep showing him more. The traveler should have tossed the journal back into the leaves and walked away, but curiosity pulled him deeper as he traced the damaged paper, trying to imagine the person who had written these words and what they had been running from when they lost the book in these woods. The traveler carried the journal into the nearest town, a small Appalachian community where conversations were quiet, and everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. He walked into a dimly lit diner that smelled of coffee left too long on the burner and bacon grease soaked into the walls. A few old men sat near the window, their hats low, their forks moving slow. When the traveler approached the counter and mentioned finding an old journal in the woods, the waitress listened politely, nodding as she wiped the same spot on the counter over and over. But the moment he said the name written inside, Whittaker, her hand froze mid-motion. The cloth dropped. Her eyes shifted to the men at the window, as if waiting for them to react before she did. They reacted instantly. Chairs scraped across the floor as one of the men stood up, his expression hard and unreadable. Another shook his head, muttering something the traveler couldn't quite catch but sounded like a warning disguised as a prayer. Conversations at other tables quieted one by one until the diner's usual sounds became a muffled silence. People didn't just stop talking, they stopped breathing normally, as though the very name risked stirring something best left asleep. The traveler felt the air thicken, an unspoken pressure tightening around the room. He tried to explain that he didn't know who the Whittakers were, that he simply found an old journal filled with strange sketches and references to the edge, but the locals didn't seem interested. It wasn't confusion on their faces. It was recognition paired with reluctance. One woman near the door whispered that he should leave it where he found it. Another man tapped the counter and suggested, without looking directly at him, that some things in the mountains were old enough to deserve privacy. The more he spoke, the colder their reactions became, as if every word he said pulled him closer to something they wanted him far away from. Even the sheriff, who happened to be eating in the corner booth, refused to make eye contact. When the traveler attempted to approach him, the sheriff held up a hand before the traveler could speak and said only, "Don't dig into that family. It's not a story you need." His tone wasn't threatening, it was tired, like someone who'd repeated the same warning too many times over too many years. With every step the traveler took toward understanding, the townspeople withdrew even further, closing their mouths and shifting their gaze to the windows as though expecting someone, or something, to appear from the tree line. The name Whittaker had turned the atmosphere inside the diner into something brittle and dangerous, a shared fear that didn't need to be spoken aloud. It was clear the journal wasn't just lost, it was avoided. And the more the town tried to push him away from the name, the more the traveler felt an irresistible pull toward uncovering why no one dared say a word about the family who lived beyond the edge of the map. The traveler left the diner with the uneasy feeling that every pair of eyes followed him to the door, not out of curiosity, but out of a shared, silent dread. He stepped outside expecting the tension to fade with the fresh air, yet the quiet of the town felt even heavier. The journal weighed in his backpack like a heartbeat he wasn't supposed to carry. He hadn't intended to search for anything, but the way the townspeople recoiled at the name made something inside him tighten with determination. He needed to understand why a simple family name could drain the color from a whole room. He studied the journal again, flipping to the crude map drawn inside. The lines weren't straight, the landmarks barely recognizable, but one detail repeated, a long, narrow road leading into the mountains, marked by a single scribbled phrase, the path that never wanted visitors. It was the only hint he had, and the only direction no one suggested he follow. So, naturally, he chose to follow it. The road wasn't marked on his GPS. When he asked an elderly man outside the general store how to reach it, the man pretended not to hear and shuffled away. Asking directions had become pointless. Whatever answers the journal offered would need to be found the hard way. He drove slowly through the outskirts of town, scanning for a break in the trees, a bend that didn't look like the others. It took nearly an hour before he spotted it, a narrow path cutting through the forest, concealed behind a curtain of overgrown brush. There were no signs, no tire tracks, no indication anyone had used it in years. Branches arched overhead like ribs of something long dead. He stopped at the entrance, sensing immediately that the road didn't feel abandoned, it felt watchful. The silence here was different from the quiet in town. In town, silence came from fear. Here, it felt like expectation. Even the wind avoided the path, shifting sideways around the trees instead of flowing through them. As he stepped forward, the gravel underfoot made a sound that echoed too far for how narrow the road was, as though someone deep in the forest had been waiting to hear it. The deeper he walked, the more the world seemed to narrow. Trees leaned in close, branches scraping together like whispers. Light thinned until even midday felt like dusk. The road twisted unnaturally, not following the land but forcing itself through it. He wondered who carved it and why no one dared maintain it. The journal's pages flashed in his mind, faces with hollow eyes, warnings scribbled in shaking hands. Whatever lay at the end of this path had shaped those drawings. By the time the road curved out of sight of the town, he felt the unmistakable sensation of crossing from one world into another, as if the mountains themselves had closed the gate behind him. The path led him deeper into the woods until the trees thickened, knitting themselves into walls that seemed designed to keep the world out. The air cooled sharply as the forest swallowed the last sliver of daylight. He hadn't expected to find anything so quickly, but as he rounded a bend, the trees parted just enough to reveal a clearing where an old, sagging house stood like a survivor of a forgotten century. Its windows were clouded with grime, the roof bowed inward, and the porch leaned forward as though exhausted from holding itself up. But it wasn't the house that froze him in place. It was the figure standing on the porch. The figure didn't move when he appeared. No shift of weight. No startled reaction. It simply stood there, a dark silhouette framed by the dying light. He couldn't tell if it was a man, woman, or something else entirely. From a distance, it didn't look entirely still, its chest didn't rise, its shoulders didn't sway, yet something in its posture suggested awareness. It was waiting, not surprised. Watching, not hiding. The traveler felt a prickle run down the back of his neck, the instinctive sense of being observed before the mind had time to confirm it. He raised a hand in greeting, forcing himself to speak. His voice sounded small, swallowed by the open space between them. The figure didn't respond. Instead, after a moment that stretched unnervingly long, it slipped backward into the house with a smoothness that felt wrong, as though gravity didn't quite apply in the same way to whatever had just retreated. The door didn't open, the figure simply seemed to melt into the shadows inside. For a moment he wondered if he'd imagined it. Maybe his eyes were playing tricks in the fading light. But then he noticed something on the porch, an old rocking chair swaying slightly, not enough to be wind, not enough to be accidental. The traveler stepped closer, listening to the boards creak beneath his feet. Every step felt like stepping into a place that didn't want him yet had been quietly expecting him. From inside the house came a soft sound, not words, not music, but a low, muffled noise like someone trying to speak through a throat unused to forming language. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't comforting either. It felt like an imitation of speech, something that had heard voices but didn't quite understand how to reproduce them. Another shadow shifted behind the front window. Then another. Shapes that were human in outline but carried a strange, unsettling stillness. No one stepped out to greet him. No one told him to leave. It was as though the family inside had been silently observing visitors for generations, gathering information without engaging, measuring him the way a wild animal measures a presence, deciding if he was a threat, prey, or simply an intruder who had wandered too far into a world meant to remain unseen. The traveler approached the house with the uneasy awareness that every step felt louder than it should, each creak of the rotting boards echoing like a warning. Up close, the structure seemed older than the trees around it, as though it had been built before the forest grew dense enough to hide it. The porch sagged beneath his weight, groaning in a way that felt almost alive. He paused at the threshold, peering through the cracked doorway, unsure if he was truly welcome or simply tolerated by whatever eyes watched him from inside. He pushed gently, and the door drifted open without resistance, as if someone had nudged it first from within. The interior of the house was dim, lit only by thin slivers of light squeezing through boards nailed across the windows. Everything smelled of wet wood and earth, as though the forest was slowly reclaiming it. Dust floated in the air like drifting ash. The first thing he noticed was the cluttered columns of old newspapers stacked to the ceiling, rusted cans arranged in patterns on the floor, and a scattering of animal traps positioned with deliberate precision. These weren't placed for practical use anymore. They were symbols, boundaries, warnings in metal form. One trap was positioned beneath a window like a guard. Another was centered perfectly in a doorway, not set to snap but left open, waiting. Furniture leaned at awkward angles, warped from moisture and time, yet every piece seemed arranged with purpose. A broken rocking chair sat in the middle of the room facing a wall where dozens of photographs had once been pinned. Only their faded outlines remained, rectangles of lighter wood marking where images had been removed long ago. Beside these empty spaces were fresh scratches etched into the paneling, long, shallow marks that formed shapes he couldn't quite decipher. They weren't letters, but they were too structured to be random. The deeper he stepped into the room, the more he noticed odd, almost ritualistic arrangements. Stacks of stones balanced on top of cabinets. Rags tied to nails like crude charms. A bundle of sticks fastened with twine and hung above a doorway like a primitive ward. The house shouldn't have been standing in such condition. Everything about it felt like it was resisting collapse through sheer stubbornness. Then he saw the corridors. Some were blocked by boards nailed haphazardly, while others were partially collapsed, leaving dark, narrow gaps that seemed to breathe cold air. One hallway in particular appeared purposefully sealed. The boards were newer than the rest of the house, hammered in with uneven force as though someone worked in a hurry to keep something behind them. He felt the sense of being watched again. It wasn't a presence in front of him this time, but from the corners of the house, from behind doorways, from the darkness in the hall. The house felt like a living record of fear and survival, an archive built from desperation rather than design. And in that moment, the traveler realized that the structure wasn't simply neglected or decaying, it was defending itself, holding together because something inside needed the walls to stay standing, no matter how old or broken they had become. The traveler stood in the dim entryway, letting his eyes adjust to the murky light filtering through the boarded windows. He felt the weight of silence pressing against his ears, so thick it almost hummed. Then, from the far side of the room, a shape moved. It wasn't sudden or startling, more like a slow realization that someone had been standing there the entire time, just beyond the line where shadow became form. The figure stepped forward into the thin streaks of light, revealing a man with tangled hair and clothes that looked decades old. His expression was blank, but not empty. It held a strange intensity, a focus that made the traveler feel as though every detail about him was being memorized without a single word exchanged. The man didn't speak. Not even a sound escaped him. Instead, he made a small gesture with his hand, an open palm turned slightly toward the traveler, not inviting, not threatening, just acknowledging. The gesture was deliberate, almost practiced. The traveler responded with a quiet greeting, but the man simply blinked, his gaze unwavering. When the traveler tried again, asking if he lived there, the man tilted his head in a slow, thoughtful motion, like someone deciphering tone rather than language. Then he pointed toward a chair in the corner, a simple, subtle indication of where the traveler should stand. It was clear he understood the presence of another person, but verbal communication seemed foreign to him. A second figure appeared behind the first, smaller and more hesitant. This one grunted softly, the sound low and rhythmic, almost like a form of communication shaped from instinct rather than speech. The first man nodded at the second, and the two exchanged gestures that formed a seamless, silent conversation. It was quick, coordinated, and strangely expressive. The traveler realized these gestures weren't random, they had meaning, structure, a language built from generations of necessity, from a life lived away from the world. What struck the traveler was how eerily perceptive the non-verbal communication felt. When he shifted his weight, the man's eyes tracked the movement with an awareness that bordered on unsettling. When he reached into his backpack to pull out the journal, the man tensed slightly, reading the motion before the traveler even spoke. It felt as though the family had developed a way of sensing intent, of understanding people without relying on traditional speech. It wasn't just observation, it was intuition sharpened by isolation. The man stepped closer and raised a hand toward the journal, not touching it, but hovering his fingers just above its cover. His breathing shifted, deepening as though he recognized something about the object. Then he tapped his own chest twice with his fingertips, a gesture that felt like a warning, a refusal, or perhaps a memory he couldn't vocalize. There was meaning in every glance, every shift of the shoulders, every tilt of the head. The traveler began to understand that silence inside this house wasn't an absence of communication. It was a different language entirely, one built from instinct, survival, and a depth of perception that felt more unsettling than any spoken words could ever be. The elderly relative appeared quietly, almost materializing from the darker end of the hallway where the shadows were thickest. Her steps were slow and deliberate, as if each movement had been practiced for years inside the cramped, creaking walls of the house. She was small, wiry, wrapped in layers of worn fabric that looked more like scraps than clothing, yet her presence filled the room with an unexpected gravity. Her eyes were pale and sharp, brighter than anyone else's in the house, and when she looked at the traveler, it was with an expression that suggested she had been expecting him long before he stepped onto their land. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she studied him, her gaze moving from his face to the journal he held. Her lips twitched at the sight of it, not in surprise but in recognition. She gestured for him to sit on an old wooden crate and lowered herself onto a stool opposite him. The other family members drifted back into the edges of the room, watching with that same eerie quietness, leaving the two of them alone in the center of the dim space. When she finally spoke, her voice was brittle, cracked with age and disuse, but steady enough to carry weight. She explained that the family hadn't always lived in such isolation. Generations ago, they had been part of the nearby town, living simple lives alongside everyone else. But then something happened. She didn't describe it as a single moment, but a chain of events that grew heavy enough to break the connection between the family and the rest of the world. She referred to it as the forgetting, a time when the outside world stopped understanding them, and the family stopped trying to be understood. Her words drifted through the room like dust shaken loose from an old attic. She spoke of a tragedy that struck the family, something that splintered them from the community and left scars that time couldn't soften. As the generations passed, fear and misunderstanding grew on both sides. The town whispered about curses and accidents that were never fully explained. The family withdrew deeper into the woods, where the whispers couldn't reach them but the silence could. Here in the mountains, cut off from the world, they created their own rhythms and patterns of survival. The children grew up without the noise of society, without the expectations of speech or schooling, without anyone telling them they were different. She said they stayed hidden because the world outside wasn't built for people like them anymore. Isolation wasn't a choice, it was a shield. But even a shield can become a prison when held too long. Her voice trembled slightly as she admitted that the forest had become both their sanctuary and their captor, a place where generations merged into a closed loop of survival and silence. She didn't ask him to understand. She only asked him not to judge what he saw, because everything the family had become was shaped by a history no outsider had ever cared to learn. As she finished speaking, she looked toward the boarded windows, as if remembering a time when sunlight came through them unobstructed. Then her gaze returned to him, filled with a sadness that felt older than the house itself, a sorrow built from years of being unseen and misunderstood. The traveler realized in that moment that the family hadn't hidden themselves from the world. The world had left them behind. Night fell quickly in the Appalachian Mountains, dragging the temperature down with it and folding the forest into shadows so dense they seemed almost physical. The traveler had set up a small tent a short distance from the house, hoping to rest before continuing his exploration at first light. He didn't expect comfort, only a place to lie still, but even the ground beneath him felt alive, pressing up against him in ways that made sleep impossible. The wind whispered through the trees with a voice that didn't belong entirely to the natural world, and the distant hoot of an owl sounded sharper, almost interrogative. He tried to focus on the journal, rereading the entries by the dim light of a lantern, but every time his eyes lifted from the pages, the darkness seemed to thicken, as if listening. Then he heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps circling the tent. Not the irregular, skittish padding of an animal, but something measured, patient, too steady to be accidental. The footsteps slowed when he froze, quickened when he moved, always surrounding him without revealing a source. Each crunch of leaves, each snap of a twig, pressed against him with a weight he couldn't see. He reached for the tent flap, considering retreat, but instinct told him to wait, to observe. Whoever, or whatever, was there, they knew he could hear them. They were testing him. The sounds grew closer, then faded, then returned, each time closer than before. It was impossible to tell how many there were. Too many for a single person to move in silence like that, too controlled for a wild animal. The traveler's heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything but the deliberate circling that seemed to map his every breath and motion. He remembered the sketches in the journal, hollow eyes, figures lurking, unblinking observers. What had seemed like exaggeration now felt like documentation of reality. He was no longer merely an observer, he was being measured, categorized, evaluated. Shadows shifted among the trees just beyond the reach of his lantern. He thought he glimpsed forms larger than a man, moving with careful patience. Leaves rustled, branches scraped, the sound so precise that it was impossible to imagine them as random. He tried to call out, to speak, but his voice came as a whisper, swallowed by the forest, as though the night itself was conspiring to prevent his presence from being acknowledged. Panic rose, but so did a strange, compulsive curiosity. He wanted to see, to know who or what was circling him, and the journal's warnings became both a shield and a lure. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Every movement of the night carried a weight, a significance he couldn't interpret but could feel in every nerve. The circling never stopped. He realized the forest was not merely around him, it was alive with intention, populated by watchers who existed in the space between trees and shadow. And as he lay frozen, he understood with an awful clarity that the Whittaker family's isolation had extended beyond the house. They, or whatever guardians had taken their place, moved unseen, silently maintaining the boundary between their world and his. The night had become a proving ground, and he had stumbled into it uninvited. By the time he returned to the house the next morning, the forest had settled into an almost deceptive calm. The sun filtered weakly through the canopy, casting fractured light across the porch and the worn steps leading inside. The traveler hesitated at the threshold, recalling the circling footsteps from the night before, but something compelled him forward. Inside, the house seemed unchanged, dim, cluttered, alive with shadows that shifted at the edge of perception. He moved cautiously through the familiar rooms, noting the precise arrangement of objects, the deliberate stillness that the family maintained, and the silent presence lingering in every corner. It was in the farthest corner of the main hallway that he noticed it, a door unlike the others. The boards around it were newer, with nails that glinted faintly in the broken light. It was sturdier than the rest of the house, reinforced with layers of wood that created a barrier no casual visitor could breach. There was no handle, only a small, square slot near the top, like something was meant to pass through without opening it. The traveler ran his fingers over the surface, feeling the roughness of fresh cuts and the faint grooves where tools had been used to force the boards into place. It wasn't simply closed. It was deliberately sealed, and the effort required to build such a barrier suggested the family feared what lay beyond it, or perhaps feared it might escape. When he stepped back, one of the figures from the shadows appeared, moving silently to stand beside the sealed door. The man or woman, it was difficult to tell, gestured toward the barrier, tapping the boards with a knuckle as if to emphasize their purpose. Then they shook their heads slowly, eyes steady, warning without speaking. There was no anger, no hostility, only the weight of generations insisting that this room remain untouched. The traveler felt the urgency of their warning pressing against him, and yet it only drew him closer. The journal had hinted at places inside the house that were off-limits, rooms that contained remnants of history, truth, and perhaps danger. He had expected clutter, decay, perhaps even secrecy, but nothing like this, a deliberate lock meant to keep knowledge, and possibly something else, hidden. He circled the door, examining the nails and boards, searching for a weak point, a clue, any sign of what could be inside. The air around it seemed colder, heavier, as though the room itself exhaled a warning. Faint marks around the edges suggested repeated attempts to reinforce the seal, hints that previous generations had guarded this place with care and anxiety. The traveler realized that this wasn't just a physical boundary, it was a psychological one, a line the family had drawn to maintain the order of their world, to protect it from intrusion and to protect the intruder from something that perhaps should never have been revealed. Every instinct told him to stop, to retreat and leave the door as it was, but his fingers itched to explore, to understand the secret hidden beyond the barrier. He felt the eyes of the unseen family members tracking his movements, judging his intentions, testing whether he belonged or whether curiosity would doom him. The locked door had become more than a threshold, it was a challenge, a symbol of the isolation that had defined the Whittaker family for generations, a boundary between what the world could touch and what must remain concealed. When the traveler finally managed to pry the boards aside enough to slip the door open, the room beyond revealed itself like a world paused in a different era. The air inside was thick and heavy, carrying a scent of damp wood, earth, and something metallic, faint but unmistakable, like iron left in the soil too long. The light from his lantern barely reached the far corners, and shadows clung to every surface, twisting ordinary objects into grotesque shapes. The floor was uneven, scarred with deep grooves, and walls were lined with shelves holding jars filled with murky liquids and unidentifiable objects suspended in them. Each jar reflected the lantern's glow, giving the room 1,000 distorted eyes, all watching, all silent. At first, he thought it was a collection of oddities, curiosities preserved by generations too isolated to discard anything. But as he moved deeper, he realized the room held a record of more than just possessions. It was a chronicle of lives compressed by isolation. There were clothes faded to gray, toys broken and chewed, sketches like those in the journal, meticulously catalogued in piles that suggested obsession, or perhaps devotion. A small cot in the corner looked as though it had been used recently, despite the layer of dust, and in one corner, a collection of masks, crude, hand-carved, some resembling human faces, others exaggerating features to a disturbing degree, were arranged in a circle. The masks stared at him, an unspoken testament to the way the family saw themselves, or perhaps how they forced each other to see the world beyond. The traveler noticed a small set of books bound in leather, each labeled with a single generation's name. Inside were detailed notes, sketches, and calculations, records of lineage, birth dates, illnesses, and peculiarities, meticulously charted. He realized the family had tracked themselves with precision, mapping traits, tendencies, and even deviations from their internal standards. There were signs of attempts to control what was passed down, hints at decisions made to preserve or manipulate certain aspects of their isolated bloodline. The more he looked, the more he saw that isolation hadn't just shaped their behavior, it had altered the very foundation of their existence, embedding a strange logic into the architecture of their lives. In one corner, a small cabinet held skeletal remains, carefully arranged, each labeled with dates and brief descriptions. The traveler felt the weight of generations staring back at him. He understood then that the family had retreated from the world not simply out of fear or secrecy, but because the world could not comprehend what they had become. The room itself seemed alive, a repository of memory and warning, a threshold between the familiar and the incomprehensible. Every object, every mark, every shadow told the same story. The Whittakers' isolation had twisted not only the family but the land itself, shaping a reality that existed entirely on its own terms, a reality that explained why the town never spoke their name, and why anyone who stumbled close would never forget the presence of something that refused to be part of the world outside.